Here's the picture you already have in your head: a walled garden, roses going soft in the morning light, a lady in white drifting between the borders with a basket over one arm, picking sweet peas for the breakfast table while a blackbird does something tasteful in the background. Burn that picture. It's wrong in almost every detail. By the time anyone in white linen sets foot in that garden, the real work has been finished for hours. Somewhere between 30 and 300 people have already been awake, sweating, swearing, and occasionally risking their lives, so that a single piece of fruit can sit on a sideboard and be ignored. The roses didn't grow themselves into that shape. Someone tied them there at 5 in the morning with cold fingers. The melon on the breakfast table was raised in a pit of rotting horse manure by a boy who started the job at 14 and will be doing it again tomorrow, whether his hands have healed or not. A Victorian kitchen garden wasn't a garden in the way we use the word now, a hobby, a Sunday afternoon, a place to grow tomatoes you'll forget to water. It was a factory. It had a workforce, a hierarchy, a wage structure, a production schedule, and an injury rate. Some of the largest ones in the country employed more staff than a moderately sized cotton mill. The walled kitchen garden built for Queen Victoria at Windsor in 1844 covered 36 acres and ran on a workforce of 150 gardeners. That is not a metaphor. That is the actual number of human beings required to keep one royal family supplied with vegetables, and almost none of it happened where anyone could see it. That was the entire point. The pleasure garden, the part with the roses and the gravel paths and the view, was built to be looked at. The kitchen garden was built to be walled off, hidden, and forgotten about by everyone except the people who worked there and the people who ate what came out of it. You were never meant to see the furnace rooms. You were never meant to hear the bell that woke 40 men before dawn. You were certainly never meant to know how much a single pineapple cost to grow, because if you knew, you might start asking uncomfortable questions about what else in your life was built on someone else's exhaustion. So tonight we're going to do exactly that. We're going over the wall. This is the quiet past, and tonight's story runs from roughly 4 in the morning until the moment a fork touches a plate. 12 chapters, one garden wall, an entire hidden economy that most of Victorian Britain ate from and never once thought about. If that sounds like your kind of morning, hit subscribe before you go any further. There's no algorithm trick to it. It just means you don't miss the next one. And if you've got a guess about what's coming, drop it in the comments now, because I promise you the truth is stranger than whatever you're picturing. Now, set your alarm. We're starting before the sun does. The hour before the world wakes up, it's 4:30 in the morning, sometime in the 1860s, and you're standing in the dark outside a brick wall that's taller than you are. You can't see much of it yet, just the shape of it against a sky that hasn't decided whether it's still night or already morning. Somewhere on the other side of that wall, something is breathing, a low, steady exhale of warm air, faintly sweet, faintly sulfurous, drifting over the top of the brick like the wall itself has a pulse. That's the boilers. They never really stop. A bell rings. Not loud, not for you. It's the kind of bell that exists purely to be obeyed, and somewhere inside the garden, men are already swinging their legs out of narrow beds in a building you haven't noticed yet, tucked against the outside of the north wall, where the sun never reaches. You'll learn what that building is later. For now, just listen to the sound it makes. Boots on a stone floor, somebody coughing, nobody talking. Talking is for later, when there's enough light to waste it. You walk along the base of the wall until you find the door, small, low, unremarkable, the kind of door that's been opened 10,000 times by people who never once stopped to admire it. Push it open and the temperature changes before your eyes adjust. It's warmer in here, noticeably warmer. You've stepped from an English morning into something that doesn't belong in England at all, and you haven't even reached the glasshouses yet. What you're standing in is a kitchen garden, usually between 1 and 5 acres, sometimes more, walled on all 4 sides in brick or stone, oriented so the best wall faces south and catches every hour of sun the climate is willing to offer. To you in the dark, it looks like nothing, a grid of paths, the black shapes of trees pinned flat against the walls like specimens. But this patch of ground has been engineered as carefully as a piece of machinery, and like a piece of machinery, it has been running continuously, every day, for years, to produce something that will be consumed in minutes and never thought about again. Keep walking. The path takes you past frames covered in matting, cold frames. You'll learn, holding seedlings that aren't ready for the open air yet, and toward a long, low range of buildings on the garden's northern edge, their roofs catching what little light there is in long, dull strips of glass. This is where the breathing sound is coming from. You step closer to one of the panes and feel actual heat radiating through the glass, the warmth of a building working hard to convince a tropical plant that it is not, in fact, currently located 40 miles from Sheffield. A door opens further along the range and a figure comes out backward, dragging something. Coal, probably, or ash, you can't quite tell in the dark, and he doesn't look up to explain himself. He's young. Younger than you'd expect for someone doing this. He disappears around the corner of the building, and a moment later you hear the unmistakable clang of a furnace door, the scrape of a shovel, the soft roar of a fire being persuaded to burn hotter than it wants to. Somewhere inside that glass house on the other side of that wall, oranges are growing, or pineapples, or a vine that produces grapes in February, a month when the only thing that should be growing in this country is mold. This is 4:30 in the morning. This is before anyone with a title has opened their eyes. This is, by any reasonable measure, the most important hour of the entire production cycle, and it belongs entirely to people whose names will never appear on anything, not a menu, not a guest list, not a single line in anyone's diary except, occasionally, the diary of the head gardener noting that Boy Hartley was late again. Here's the thing that's hard to get your head around, standing in this particular dark. None of this was incidental. None of this was a garden that happened to need some looking after. This was infrastructure. A large country estate in the second half of the 19th century might run a kitchen garden with a workforce of 30, 40, 50 people, sometimes more, each with a defined role, a fixed wage, a strict hierarchy of authority, and a production target that didn't care whether it was January or June, because the house upstairs expected grapes, peaches, and pineapples regardless of season. And the entire point of the garden was to lie convincingly to the climate until it produced them anyway. You'll meet the man in charge of all this eventually. Every great Victorian garden had one, and the best of them were treated less like gardeners and more like generals. You'll meet the boys at the bottom of the ladder too, the 14-year-olds doing the worst jobs for the least money with the dimmest prospect of escape, except through exactly the kind of brutal, decades-long apprenticeship that turned a farm laborer's 7th son into one of the most famous men in England. That story's coming. It's one of the best true stories of the entire 19th century, and it starts in exactly this kind of garden, on exactly this kind of morning. But first, you need to understand the wall, not the people, not yet. The wall itself, because everything that's about to happen in this garden, every absurd, magnificent, occasionally fatal thing, happens because somebody figured out that if you build a wall the right way, you can make it lie about the weather. And once the Victorians worked out how convincingly a wall could lie, they never really stopped pushing to see how far the lie could go. Stand here a moment longer. Listen to the boilers breathe. Somewhere past these walls, in a bed nobody's bothered to make yet, the lady of the house is still asleep, and she has absolutely no idea what it's costing to keep her in pineapples. She'll find out eventually. So will you. The wall that lied about the weather here's a question worth sitting with for a second. Why build a wall around a vegetable patch at all? The obvious answer is rabbits, deer, the odd opportunistic poacher. And sure, that's part of it. Nobody wants to spend a growing season raising cabbages just to watch a herd of fallow deer treat the place like a salad bar. But that's not why the walls at places like Croom Court in Worcestershire run 13 feet high and were built with 5 separate furnaces embedded inside the brickwork. You don't need a furnace to keep out a rabbit. You need a furnace because the wall isn't just a fence. It's a battery. Brick and stone are good at one specific trick. They soak up heat during the day and let it go slowly, over hours, long after the sun that gave it to them has gone down. A south-facing wall in an English garden spends all day quietly absorbing whatever warmth the sky is willing to provide, and then it spends the night giving that warmth back to whatever's growing right up against it. Plant a peach tree 2 feet from open ground, and a hard frost will kill the blossom before it ever becomes fruit. Plant the same tree flat against 8 feet of sun-warmed brick, trained out sideways into the shape of a candelabra, espaliard in the gardener's term, and that tree is living in a slightly different, slightly kinder country than the one technically surrounding it. That's the basic trick. The Victorians, never satisfied with a trick that could be pushed further, immediately pushed it further. If a solid wall could store the sun's heat and release it slowly, what would happen if the wall could make its own heat, independent of the sun entirely? The answer, built into garden walls across the country from the late 18th century onward, was the hot wall, also called a flue wall or a fruit wall, depending on which county you were standing in. Picture an ordinary brick wall, except it isn't solid. It's hollow, riddled inside with a winding channel, and at one end of that channel sits a small furnace, usually tended from a service passage on the unfashionable side of the wall where nobody from the house would ever wander. Light the furnace, and smoke and hot air don't just vanish up a chimney. They travel the length of the wall first, through the hidden channel, baking the brick from the inside before finally escaping through a flue at the far end. The wall becomes, in effect, a very slow, very large radiator. Walled gardens at Croxteth Hall near Liverpool and Bank Hall in Lancashire still have examples of this construction standing today. Brick skins built around a network of tunnels that once carried nothing but heat, and the patient labor of somebody keeping a small fire burning through a January night for the sake of a wall that would never say thank you. By the early 19th century, some of these systems had been refined into proper boiler and pipe arrangements rather than open flues, hot water circulating through iron pipes laid against the back of the wall, more controllable, less smoky, somewhat less likely to set the brickwork on fire if a furnace tender fell asleep. But the principle never changed. Somewhere out of sight, somebody was burning fuel so that a wall could pretend to be a different latitude. And once you've convinced yourself that a wall can lie about the weather, the next logical move is obvious. If a flat wall heated from behind can grow peaches that shouldn't survive a British winter, what happens if you build a wall out of glass instead of brick, and let the sun do for free what the furnace was doing by hand? This is where the story of the Victorian garden stops being about walls and starts being about glass. And to understand why glass changed everything, you need to understand how expensive glass used to be. For most of the Georgian period and the early decades of Victoria's reign, glass in Britain was taxed by weight. The Glass Excise Act had been around since the early 18th century in various forms, and its effect was straightforward. Every pane of glass you wanted, in a window or a greenhouse or anywhere else, cost noticeably more than the raw material alone would suggest, because the government was taking a cut on the way through. This is, by the way, where the architectural habit of small window panes set in many narrow glazing bars comes from not aesthetic preference, but tax avoidance at a national scale. Big sheets of glass were a luxury. Small sheets, lots of them, joined together with wood, were the practical compromise. A glasshouse built under those conditions was, by necessity, a heavy, dark, expensive thing, a lot of timber, a lot of small panes, a lot of shadow falling exactly where you didn't want it if you were trying to grow something that needed every scrap of light England was willing to provide in February. For decades, this was simply the ceiling on what was possible. You could heat a glasshouse all you liked. You couldn't out-engineer a tax. Then, in 1845, the glass excise was repealed, and almost immediately afterward, manufacturing improvements, particularly in the production of cheap, reasonably large sheet glass, made it possible to glaze a building in a way that would have been financially unthinkable 20 years earlier. The effect on country house gardens was close to instantaneous. Within a couple of decades, it was entirely normal for a third of the area inside a kitchen garden's walls to be standing under glass. Not a single greenhouse tucked discreetly in a corner, entire ranges of glasshouses, sometimes hundreds of feet long, running the length of an interior wall, each section tuned to a different purpose. One for peaches, one for grapes, one for the orchids that had become a competitive obsession among the wealthy, one purely for raising the seedlings that would go on to fill the borders the family actually walked through. This is worth pausing on because it's easy to let the word greenhouse call to mind something small and domestic, 6 feet of aluminum frame at the bottom of a suburban garden, mostly used for tomatoes and the occasional spider. What was being built on the great estates in the 1850s and 1860s was closer to a small industrial campus. At Audley End in Essex, the surviving range includes a vinery stretching over 50 meters, originally divided into 5 separate sections, each maintained at a different temperature and humidity for a different crop, with an entire suite of backsheds behind it, workshops, a potting shed, a mushroom house, tool storage, and the bothy where the young, unmarried gardeners actually lived, all built into the unglamorous north side where nobody from the house would ever think to look. The boiler that fed the whole system sat in a pit behind the wall, fed by hand, around the clock, by somebody whose name does not appear on a single garden guidebook you will ever read. And the heating systems themselves became genuinely sophisticated engineering, not just a furnace and a prayer. Across the Victorian period, boiler technology moved from simple cast iron stoves at the start of the century to elaborate segmental boilers running pressurized hot water systems by its end, with networks of pipes laid beneath iron floor gratings, so the heat rose evenly through the structure rather than baking one corner while leaving another to frost. At Kew, the Palm House was served by a 150-meter underground tunnel, built specifically so that coal could be delivered to the boilers by a small underground railway, and the resulting smoke and soot carried well away from the glass before anyone noticed the building was, structurally speaking, on fire in a controlled and ongoing way every single day for decades. That tunnel still exists. Today it houses an office. For most of the 19th century, it was the lungs of an artificial tropics, sitting under one of the most photographed buildings in London. What all of this adds up to is a simple, slightly uncomfortable point. The serene, sun-dappled image we have of a Victorian glasshouse, wrought iron, glittering panes, ferns nodding gently in dappled light, was the visible 10% of a structure whose other 90% was combustion. Coal in, smoke out, heat redirected with as much precision as 19th century plumbing allowed, all of it tended by hand, all of it running through the hours when the rest of the household was unconscious. Every curling fern frond and every velvet-skinned peach hanging improbably from a branch in an English February existed because somebody, somewhere on the property, was shoveling fuel into a fire at 3 in the morning so that a wall or a roof or an entire building could keep telling a convincing lie about the season. There's a comparison sitting right here that's almost too easy to make, so let's make it anyway. Every time you order strawberries in December and don't think twice about it, you are benefiting from a version of the same lie, just relocated. The Victorian solution was a coal furnace and a glass roof 8 feet from the dining room. Ours is a refrigerated shipping container and a supply chain that stretches halfway around the planet. The climate still says no. We've just gotten much better at making sure the no never reaches the breakfast table. The Victorians, to their credit, never pretended the lie was free. They simply made sure the bill went somewhere nobody at breakfast would ever see it. One more thing about these walls before we go further inside them, because it matters for everything that follows. The kitchen garden wasn't just hidden behind brick for the plant's benefit. It was hidden for everyone's benefit in the social arithmetic of the period. The pleasure garden, the lawns, the terraces, the ornamental borders nearer the house belonged to the family and their guests. The kitchen garden, walled off on the working side of the estate, belonged to the staff, and the etiquette was unspoken but absolute. The gardeners were expected to vanish the moment the family was likely to wander through, and the family, for their part, mostly didn't wander through at all. The wall wasn't only keeping the cold out. It was keeping an entire workforce and the visible evidence of their labor conveniently out of sight, which means that everything you're about to see, the boilers, the boy with the coal, the men who haven't slept properly in a decade because the rhubarb sheds don't care what time it is, happened entirely behind a wall built, in part, specifically so that nobody who benefited from it would ever have to watch. You're on the wrong side of that wall now. Keep walking. There's a building ahead with the lights still on, and the man inside it is the closest thing this garden has to a king. The order of things, every army needs a structure, and a Victorian kitchen garden was, in every meaningful sense, run like one. At the top sat the head gardener, and if you're picturing someone who pottered about with a trowel and a watering can, you're picturing the wrong job entirely. A head gardener on a large estate was responsible for as many as 30 or 40 staff, a production schedule that fed an entire household year-round, and a horticultural operation worth, in some cases, more than £1,000 a year in wages alone, a genuinely substantial sum in an era when a skilled tradesman in a city might earn a fraction of that. At Wentworth Woodhouse in South Yorkshire, the home of the Earls Fitzwilliam, the garden staff had grown by the mid-19th century to somewhere between 40 and 50 men, with an annual wage bill running past £1,000. At Clumber Park in Nottinghamshire, the head gardener in 1905 was managing 29 men on a similar budget. These weren't garden teams, they were payrolls. The head gardener's compensation reflected the responsibility. Surveys from the period put a head gardener's salary on a large estate at somewhere around £100 a year, occasionally rising to 120, comparable to or slightly better than the salary of a head clerk in a respectable office, and roughly on par with some of the most senior indoor servants in the household. He typically got something none of his subordinates did: a house. As often it was built directly into the wall of the kitchen garden itself, sometimes literally in the middle of it, as at Castle Howard in Yorkshire, on the simple logic that a man who lived inside his own factory could keep an eye on the boilers at 2 in the morning without having to get dressed first. It was, in its way, one of the more honest pieces of architecture in the entire estate. The only person trusted to sleep close to the furnace was the man held personally responsible for what happened if it went out. Below him came the foremen and under gardeners, men, usually with years of experience already behind them, each given charge of a specific department. One might run the kitchen garden proper, the rows of vegetables that fed the servants' hall as much as the family table. Another ran the flower garden, source of the cut blooms that filled the vases upstairs and were swapped out fresh, sometimes daily, by staff working before the family woke. Another took the hothouses, the most technically demanding posting, requiring an understanding of heating systems, humidity, and the exact, fussy preferences of plants that had no business growing in England at all. A journeyman gardener in 1860 could expect to earn around £36 a year, a respectable wage for a young, unmarried man with a recognized trade behind him. Below the journeymen came the improvers, young men, often in their late teens or early 20s, who had served an apprenticeship and were now refining their craft under supervision, typically earning as little as £20 a year. And at the very bottom of the ladder, earning less than that, sat the garden boys, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, frequently no older than 14 or 15, doing the coldest, dirtiest, least skilled work in the entire operation, fetching, carrying, weeding, watering, feeding furnaces through the night, in exchange for a wage that barely qualified as one, plus whatever food and basic lodging the estate was willing to throw in. This was, on paper, a career ladder, and it's worth being fair to it. It genuinely was one. A boy who started at 12, survived the bothy, kept his nose clean, and impressed the right people could, over 15 or 20 years, climb from garden boy to improver to journeyman to under gardener to foreman. And for the small number with the talent, the timing, and the right reference at the right moment, all the way to head gardener on an estate of his own, with a house built into the wall and a wage to match. It was one of the few genuinely meritocratic paths available to a working-class boy in Victorian Britain, which is exactly why so many ambitious young men without family money or connections threw themselves into it. You'll meet the most spectacular example of this ladder, working exactly as advertised in the next chapter, and his story is genuinely one of the great social mobility stories of the 19th century. But it's worth saying plainly, before you fall in love with the ladder, for every boy who climbed it, there were dozens who didn't, and the system had no shortage of ways to make sure of that. Start with where these boys actually lived. Married gardeners with families were typically given estate cottages, modest but private, a roof of their own. Unmarried men and boys, by contrast, were housed together in a building called a bothy, usually positioned just outside the kitchen garden wall, close enough that nobody would be late for the morning bell, far enough that nobody from the house would have to look at it. The arrangement had an obvious institutional logic: keep the young, unmarried workforce on a short leash, and you always have spare hands on call to water a glasshouse at midnight or stoke a boiler before sunrise. Some employers took genuine pride in their bothies. Leopold Rothschild's estate at Ascot provided picturesque accommodation and even laid out a cricket pitch for the young gardeners' time off, a small gesture toward treating them as people rather than fixtures. Plenty of other estates were considerably less generous. The horticultural press of the period, gardeners read voraciously and wrote prolifically, leaving behind a genuinely rich record of their own working lives, regularly carried complaints about bothies that were cold, damp, poorly maintained, and furnished with little more than straw for bedding. A boy might spend the only hours of his day not actively working crammed into a building barely warmer than the glasshouse he'd just left, except that the glasshouse, at least, had a furnace someone was paid to maintain. Then there was the apprenticeship system itself, which sat on a fault line between genuine mentorship and outright exploitation, depending entirely on the character of whichever head gardener happened to be standing over you. Some of the great teaching gardens of the period had head gardeners who took real, personal interest in developing the young men under their charge, passing on the accumulated craft of decades, writing references that genuinely meant something, treating the apprenticeship as a calling rather than a racket. Others operated a far less noble arrangement, an apprentice fee, charged either as a lump sum up front or, more commonly, skimmed week after week directly out of a boy's already meager wages, in exchange for the privilege of being taught a trade he was simultaneously being paid almost nothing to perform. It was, in effect, a tax on ambition, collected by the very people positioned to decide whether that ambition would ever lead anywhere. And the stakes of getting on the wrong side of a head gardener were genuinely severe, because the entire system ran on references. Promotion from improver to under-gardener, from under-gardener to foreman, depended almost entirely on a good word from the head gardener and the garden's owner. Without it, a young man's horticultural career effectively stalled in place, and the alternative wasn't unemployment exactly, but something close to professional exile. A gardener without a usable reference became what the trade itself called a jobbing gardener, someone working single-handed, estate to estate, or attached loosely to a nursery business, picking up whatever piecework he could find, looked down on by nearly everyone else in the profession. It was a trade with a genuine ladder and a genuine trapdoor, and which one you encountered depended a great deal on the temperament of one man, in one garden, who you'd had the bad luck or good fortune to end up working under. The hours, across nearly every rung of this ladder, were brutal by any standard, including the standards of the time. Surviving orders and regulations from Wentworth Woodhouse, dated 1863, lay the schedule out with the flat precision of a railway timetable. From the start of April to the end of September, the working day ran from 6 in the morning until 6 at night. In March and October, 6:30 to 5:30. February and November dropped to 7 until 5. January and December, the depths of the winter, when there was barely enough daylight to justify the hours at all, ran from 7:45 in the morning until 4:30 in the afternoon. 6 days a week, every week, with the Saturday shift cut slightly short at 4. An hour off for lunch, with the gate bell ringing at noon to market. Once a fortnight on a Friday, that lunch hour stretched to 90 minutes, not out of any particular generosity, but because that was payday, and the men needed time to queue at the head gardener's office and collect what they'd earned. Run the arithmetic across a typical week, and the figure that comes out the other side is somewhere around 60 hours, for nearly the entire year, for wages that, even at the relatively respectable journeyman rate, left very little room for anything resembling a life outside the wall. Compare that to a head clerk earning a broadly similar annual salary in an office somewhere, working a fraction of those hours indoors in the dry, and the disparity in actual lived experience between two roughly comparable Victorian incomes becomes obvious fast. Gardening paid reasonably well by the standards of the manual trades. It also asked for nearly every waking hour you had for decades in exchange. It's tempting, looking at this from a couple of centuries' distance, to see a clean and simple villain in the story, the cruel head gardener, the absentee duke, the system itself. The truth is messier and somehow more uncomfortable than that. Most of the men running these gardens weren't monsters. Many of them had themselves been the boy in the bothy 30 years earlier, had themselves paid an apprentice fee out of wages that could barely absorb it, had themselves spent a January feeding a furnace at 4 in the morning, with hands that had long since stopped fully warming up between shifts. The system didn't require villains to keep running. It just required everyone inside it to accept that this was simply what the job was, the way you'd accept that water is wet, and to pass that acceptance down, more or less intact, to whichever boy showed up next, hopeful, underpaid, and entirely unaware of exactly how long the ladder above him actually was. What the system did produce, with startling reliability, was expertise. The gardeners who survived this apprenticeship, who made it through the bothies and the apprentice fees and the 60-hour weeks, and came out the other side as foremen, then under gardeners, then, for a fortunate handful, head gardeners in their own right, became some of the most technically accomplished horticulturists in the world. They wrote the gardening manuals. They edited the gardening journals. They sat on the committees of the Horticultural Society. They corresponded with botanists, organized plant hunting expeditions to places most of them would never personally visit, and built, behind walls nobody from the house ever looked at twice, some of the most sophisticated growing technology of the entire industrial age. One of them, more than any other, became proof that the ladder could go all the way to the top, past head gardener entirely, into a kind of fame that had no real precedent for a man who'd started his working life as a 15-year-old garden boy with a wage that barely covered his boots. His name was Joseph Paxton, and his climb starts, like everything in this story, before the sun came up. The boy who scaled the wall at 4:30, it's the 9th of May, 1826, and you are 23 years old, and you have spent the entire night on top of a stagecoach. You got on at Chiswick. You're getting off eventually in Derbyshire on the strength of a single conversation with a duke you've spoken to perhaps a dozen times in your life, a deaf man who likes to walk in gardens, who happened to like the way you spoke clearly enough for him to follow, who has just, more or less on the spot, made you head gardener of one of the most important estates in England. You don't have the job in any formal sense yet. You have an understanding, a coach ticket, and absolutely nothing else, and you are not going to wait around for paperwork to catch up with opportunity. You change coaches at some godforsaken hour of the night and arrive in Chesterfield in the kind of darkness that makes a person doubt whether the sun still exists at all. You don't wait for daylight either. You walk the rest of the way, and you reach Chatsworth at 4:30 in the morning, alone, unannounced, and because nobody has thought to give you a key, on account of the fact that technically you don't have the job yet, you do the only sensible thing available to a determined 23-year-old standing outside a locked kitchen garden in the dark. You climb the wall. You let yourself down on the other side and walk the grounds in the gray, unfinished light before sunrise, and what you find isn't encouraging. The gardens at Chatsworth have been neglected for years. The previous Duke had little interest in horticulture, and it shows in every overgrown border and untended bed you pass. But you don't stand there feeling discouraged about it. You find the men who are due to start work, and you set them to it on your own authority, before anyone has formally confirmed you have any authority at all. Then you go and find breakfast, because it's been a very long night, and you sit down with the housekeeper to eat it. That's where you meet her niece. Her name is Sarah Bone. You will marry her within the year, and it will turn out, though you don't know this yet, eating breakfast as a stranger in a kitchen that isn't officially yours, to be one of the 2 best decisions you will ever make in a life that is about to be unusually full of them. By your own later account, you have explored the gardens, climbed a wall, organized a workforce, eaten breakfast, and met your future wife, all before 9 o'clock in the morning. It's the kind of story that sounds too neat to be true, the sort of thing a man invents for himself 30 years later when he's famous, and the facts have had time to improve with retelling. It is also, as far as anyone has ever been able to establish, more or less exactly what happened. This is Joseph Paxton, and this single morning tells you almost everything you need to know about how he was going to spend the next 4 decades. He was born in 1803, though for most of his adult life, even Paxton himself believed and stated it was 1801, the result of a small lie he'd told as a teenager to make himself look old enough for a job he wanted. The truth came out late in his life, when he finally admitted the deception, by which point the wrong date had already found its way into enough official records that confusion about it persists in reference books to this day. A strangely fitting footnote for a man whose entire career was a study in talking your way past whatever barrier happened to be standing in front of you. He was born in the village of Milton Bryan in Bedfordshire, the youngest of 8 children, the son of an agricultural laborer named William Paxton and his wife Anne Rooke. There was no money in the family, no land, no connections, nothing resembling a head start. What there was, by every account that survives him, was an unusual amount of intelligence packed into a body that was put to physical work the moment it was old enough to be useful. At 15, in 1818, he became a garden boy, the lowest rung on exactly the ladder you read about in the last chapter, working for Sir Gregory Osborne Page Turner at Battlesden Park, near Woburn. He moved through several positions after that, the ordinary, unglamorous churn of a young gardener building experience one estate at a time, before arriving in 1823 at the Horticultural Society's gardens at Chiswick, a serious posting, the closest thing the period had to a proving ground for ambitious horticulturists, and one that happened to sit conveniently close to Chiswick House, the property of William Cavendish, 6th Duke of Devonshire. Within a year, Paxton had been promoted to foreman in charge of the arboretum there, 33 acres of it, with his weekly wage climbing from 14 shillings to 18, a meaningful raise for a young man with nothing else to fall back on, and a sign already that whoever was watching him work had decided he was worth keeping. Someone was. The Duke liked to walk in those gardens, and he liked to talk to the young foreman he kept running into there. By most accounts, what cemented the relationship wasn't really Paxton's horticultural talent, considerable as it already was. It was something far more ordinary. The Duke was profoundly deaf, and Paxton, alone among most of the people he dealt with, took the trouble to speak slowly and clearly enough that the Duke could actually follow the conversation. It is one of the great, slightly absurd footnotes of 19th century social mobility that the path from garden boy to national icon may have run, in no small part, through good enunciation. Whatever the precise mixture of talent, charm, and clear vowels involved, the result was the offer that put Paxton on that stagecoach. Head gardener at Chatsworth, the Duke's principal Derbyshire estate, one of the great gardens of the age, and at that moment, by every account, in a genuine state of disrepair. It was an enormous responsibility to hand a 23-year-old with no formal education and no family standing whatsoever. The Duke handed it to him anyway, and Paxton spent the rest of that single, improbable morning proving the trust hadn't been misplaced. What followed over the next several years was less a gardening career than a kind of slow-motion demonstration of how much one's self-taught, relentlessly curious man could accomplish if you simply gave him land, a budget, and almost total creative freedom. One of his earliest projects was redesigning the garden around the new north wing of the house and expanding the estate's modest collection of conifers into what became a 40-acre arboretum, eventually holding more than 1,600 different specimens. A tree museum, effectively, planted from scratch by a man who'd been a farm laborer's son fewer than 2 decades earlier. In the course of building it, he became remarkably skilled at the genuinely difficult and dangerous business of transplanting fully mature trees, the largest of them weighing somewhere around 8 tons, moved bodily from Kettleston Road in Derby to Chatsworth using nothing but Victorian engineering and presumably a great deal of rope. There was a rock garden, built in part as a tribute to the Duke's memories of touring the Alps. There was the Emperor Fountain, completed in 1844, which threw a single jet of water to a height of more than 250 feet, twice the height of Nelson's Column, and which required, before it could fire a single drop, the excavation of a feeder lake on the hillside above the gardens involving roughly 100,000 cubic yards of earth, dug out entirely by hand, by men whose names history did not think worth recording, so that a duke could occasionally impress a visiting dignitary with a column of water. There was the rebuilding of the entire estate village of Edensor, undertaken largely because the Duke had decided the existing village spoiled the view from the house. An entire community of ordinary people's homes torn down and reconstructed elsewhere for the sake of one man's sightline, with Paxton overseeing the practical execution of a decision that, looked at from any angle other than the Duke's own bedroom window, was a fairly extraordinary piece of vanity. And in 1832, his attention turned to something that would eventually outgrow every other achievement on this list combined: greenhouses. Specifically, the practical problem of growing things that did not want to grow in Derbyshire at all. He began designing buildings fitted with what were called forcing frames, structures intended to coax fruit trees trained flat against walls the espaliers from the last chapter, into producing earlier and more reliably than the open climate would allow, and alongside them, structures purpose-built for one of the single most absurd, expensive, and status-obsessed crops in the entire history of English horticulture, the pineapple. We'll get to the pineapple. It deserves and is going to receive an entire chapter of its own, because the story of how an English duke's garden came to be capable of growing a fruit native to South America at enormous expense, almost entirely for the purpose of looking impressive, tells you more about Victorian wealth than almost anything else in this entire script. But first, it's worth pausing on what Paxton was building alongside all of this, almost as a side project to his side project. Starting in 1831, he founded and edited a monthly magazine for working gardeners called the Horticultural Register, deliberately positioned as cheaper and easier to read than its more established rival, and successful enough that it noticeably ate into that rival's readership within a few years. He followed it with Paxton's Magazine of Botany in 1833, which ran for 16 years and became genuinely popular reading well beyond the small circle of professional horticulturists. In 1841, he co-founded what would become the single most influential gardening publication of the century, the Gardener's Chronicle, alongside the botanist John Lindley and others. A man who had received almost no formal schooling, who had started his working life carrying tools for a baronet's gardener at 15, had entirely through his own self-taught fluency become one of the most widely read garden writers in the country, while simultaneously running one of its most demanding estates and raising what would eventually be 8 children with Sarah, 6 of whom survived to adulthood. It's tempting telling this story to make it sound like a clean fairy tale. Farm boy works hard, climbs ladder, becomes famous, the end. The truth, as it almost always does, resists that shape. Paxton's career from this point forward was about to involve real triumph, genuine engineering brilliance, a friendship with a duke that crossed the rigid class boundaries of the period in ways that still surprise historians who study it, and also real loss, including a tragedy that struck 2 of his own men on the far side of the world, and the death of his own eldest son. None of what made Paxton remarkable came free. It came, like everything else in this garden, at a cost that the people enjoying the results almost never had to look at directly. He was about to build something that would outgrow Chatsworth, outgrow gardening entirely, and end up housing the largest public exhibition the world had ever seen. But that story needs the pineapple first, because before Paxton built the building that made him internationally famous, he spent years perfecting the much smaller, much stranger art of growing a single, absurdly expensive tropical fruit in the English Midlands, for a duke who could easily have just bought the thing from a shop in London, if shops in London had reliably sold anything worth eating. They didn't, not for this fruit, not in any form a duke would have considered acceptable. Which is exactly why an entire branch of Victorian horticulture grew up around solving a problem that, by any rational measure, didn't need solving at all. 40 pounds of pressure and a pineapple push open the low door at the end of the glasshouse range, and the smell hits you before anything else does. It's warm, damp, and unmistakably, unapologetically of manure, not an unpleasant smell exactly once you've stood in it a minute, but a heavy one, the kind that gets into your coat and stays there for the rest of the day. This is the pinery, and the fruit you've come to see is, by a wide margin, the single most expensive thing currently growing anywhere on this entire estate. Look down into the long pit running the length of the structure, and you'll see the engineering behind that smell. A bed of decomposing horse manure, packed in deep, generating heat the old-fashioned way through the simple biochemistry of rot, with a layer of tanner's bark laid over the top of it to moderate the temperature, because raw manure on its own runs far too hot for a young plant to survive. Sunk into that bark in pots sit the pineapple plants themselves, spiky, faintly absurd-looking things, utterly unbothered by the fact that they are, geographically speaking, in completely the wrong country. Keeping that pit at the right temperature, day and night, for the better part of 2 years before a single fruit is ready to cut, is a full-time job for someone, and that someone has just spent the early hours of this same morning out here checking it, while you were still standing outside the wall in the dark. This single piece of fruit, sitting on a plant that won't be ready to harvest for months yet, will be worth, by the time it reaches the table, more than most of the people who grew it earn in a year. To understand how something this ridiculous became normal, you have to go back more than a century before Victoria ever took the throne, to 1493 and Christopher Columbus's second voyage, when European sailors first encountered the pineapple on the island of Guadeloupe. It made the journey back to Europe slowly and badly. Sailing ships of the period were neither fast enough nor cool enough to transport a tropical fruit across the Atlantic without it arriving rotten, and for roughly 2 centuries, that simple logistical failure was enough to turn the pineapple into one of the most desirable objects in England. King Charles II liked the fruit enough to commission a painting of himself receiving one as a gift, the pineapple positioned in the foreground with the unmistakable visual weight of a crown jewel, because at that moment in English social history, it more or less was one. By the height of the 18th century, owning, or even just briefly possessing, a pineapple had become a genuinely serious marker of wealth, and the economics behind that status were not subtle. Even once English gardeners worked out how to cultivate the fruit domestically, using exactly the kind of heated pit you're standing next to right now, the cost of getting a single pineapple from seed to ripe fruit ran to several £1,000s in modern terms. Reasonable estimates put the figure somewhere between £5,000 and £10,000, sustained over roughly 2 years of dedicated, round-the-clock cultivation for one piece of fruit. A pineapple, in other words, could cost more than a horse, and because it cost more than a horse, actually cutting one open and eating it was widely considered a faintly vulgar waste of an asset that was worth so much more simply being looked at. So that's largely what people did with them. Display, not consumption, became the entire point of the exercise. A host wealthy enough to procure a pineapple, whether grown on their own estate or, far more commonly, simply purchased at extraordinary expense, would set it on a dedicated wooden plinth at the center of the dinner table, where guests could admire it, comment on it, and understand precisely what it implied about the household hosting them, all without anyone laying a knife to it. The fruit appeared carved into furniture, sculpted onto garden temples and gateposts, painted onto carriage doors, and worked into the architecture of buildings that had nothing whatsoever to do with fruit, a habit so persistent that London is, to this day, quietly dotted with small stone and ironwork pineapples on railings and rooftops, the lingering decorative residue of a status obsession that peaked generations before any of those buildings were finished. The most famous monument to the whole phenomenon still stands in Scotland, a folly built in the shape of a colossal stone pineapple, roof and all, constructed purely so its owner could say, without exaggeration, that he had built a pineapple. And for those who couldn't afford to own one outright, an entire small rental economy sprang up to fill the gap. A pineapple could be hired by the hour, paraded at a party, displayed on a sideboard for an evening's entertaining, and then returned to be hired out again to the next household further down the social ladder, working its way through a circuit of dinner parties before it was finally sold, usually once it had begun, despite everyone's best efforts to spoil, to whoever was left holding it when its display value finally ran out. It is one of the more genuinely surreal footnotes in English social history that, for a stretch of the 18th century, there was real commercial demand for a pineapple rental trade, conducted with the same seriousness you'd expect from hiring a carriage or a string quartet. By the time Victoria came to the throne, the pure rental fad had mostly faded, commercial cultivation had expanded enough, and shipping had improved enough that simply possessing a pineapple no longer carried quite the same shock value it once had. But the underlying obsession didn't disappear, it mutated. Where a Georgian aristocrat had proven his wealth by acquiring a pineapple from anywhere, by any means, a Victorian estate owner increasingly wanted to prove something more specific, that he could grow one himself, on his own land, in defiance of his own climate, using his own staff and his own money. The flex shifted from possession to production, and production, as you've just walked through, required exactly the kind of elaborate, manure-heated, round-the-clock infrastructure that turned an ordinary kitchen garden into something closer to an industrial research facility. This is precisely the world Joseph Paxton stepped into in 1832, when his attention at Chatsworth turned to forcing frames and the cultivation of, as one record of the period dryly put it, highly prized pineapples. The 6th Duke of Devonshire wasn't trying to rent a pineapple for an evening's entertainment. He was trying to demonstrate, through Paxton's hands, that Chatsworth's gardens could produce fruit good enough, reliably enough, that the question of where it came from would never need to be asked by a guest at his table. The pineapple had stopped being primarily a thing you owned and become, instead, a thing you proved you were capable of, a horticultural credential as much as a piece of fruit, and one that a head gardener's whole reputation could rest on. It's worth sitting with the basic absurdity of the economics here for a second, because it doesn't really fade no matter how many times you look at it. An entire structure had to be built. An entire system for generating and regulating heat through decomposing manure had to be maintained every single day for roughly 2 years by a dedicated member of staff whose annual wage was a fraction of what the resulting fruit would eventually be valued at. The fruit itself, once finally ripe, would in many households still never be eaten, would simply sit on a table for one evening, admired, photographed only in the sense that a portrait might later be commissioned of it, and then either discreetly consumed by the kitchen staff once its display purpose had been served, or allowed to spoil, having already accomplished everything it was grown to accomplish purely by existing in the right room at the right time. There's a version of this story happening right now, if you look for it, and it's worth naming plainly rather than leaving as an implication. We don't grow pineapples in heated manure pits anymore, obviously. We fly them, by the container load from Costa Rica and the Philippines, refrigerated the entire way, so cheaply that a single pineapple now costs roughly what a cup of coffee does, sitting in a supermarket display under fluorescent light that nobody finds remarkable in the slightest. The labor hasn't gone away. It's just moved somewhere we don't have to smell it, onto plantations, into shipping containers, behind a supply chain stretched thin enough across the planet that almost none of us ever have to stand next to the actual conditions that put the fruit on the shelf. The Victorian pineapple cost a fortune and announced that fact loudly on a plinth in the middle of a dinner table. The modern pineapple costs almost nothing and announces nothing at all. Which one of those represents progress depends entirely on what exactly you think the cost was actually measuring. Back in the pinery, the gardener checking the manure bed this particular morning has no philosophical opinions on any of this. He has a temperature to maintain and a duke who will want a progress report by lunchtime. The pineapple doesn't know it's a symbol. It's just a plant doing the only thing plants know how to do, a very long way from home, in a hole full of warm horse manure, watched over by a boy who is colder than it is and paid considerably less to be there. Outside the pinery, the morning is finally, properly beginning. There's another building you need to see before the sun gets much higher, one with no heat in it at all, where the cold isn't a problem to be solved, but the entire point. Darkness, frost, and rhubarb loud enough to hear this next building has no boiler breathing through its walls, no glass roof catching the light. It's the opposite of everything you've seen so far, windowless, low, built deliberately to keep every trace of daylight out rather than coax it in. Someone hands you a candle before you go inside and tells you quietly not to bring anything brighter. You're about to find out why. Inside, in the thin orange wobble of candlelight, the shapes are strange before your eyes make sense of them. Row after row of pale, impossibly long stalks reaching up out of the dark in total silence, except it isn't quite total. If you stand still and actually listen, you can hear something, a faint creak, an occasional soft crack like a knuckle popping somewhere just out of sight. The rhubarb in this shed is growing fast enough right now while you're standing in it that you can hear it happening. This is forced rhubarb, and the entire process, by the time the Victorians had finished refining it, ran on a deliberate, almost cruel exploitation of a plant's basic instincts. Rhubarb spends its first 2 years growing normally, out in the open field, doing nothing more dramatic than any other hardy plant, building up energy in its roots, storing carbohydrate against the winter the way plants have done since long before anyone thought to grow them in rows. Then, once the first hard frost of the year has done its work, the roots are lifted from the ground and moved indoors, into sheds exactly like this one, pitch black, kept artificially warm. The plant, suddenly convinced that winter has somehow turned straight into spring without the inconvenience of actually getting any sunlight, panics in the only way a rhubarb root knows how. It throws everything it has into growth, reaching desperately upward in search of light that simply isn't coming, and the result is genuinely extraordinary stalks that can grow more than an inch in a single day, fast enough under the right conditions to produce an audible creaking and cracking as the cells stretch and split. People who have worked in these sheds for a lifetime will tell you, without exaggeration, that on a quiet night you really can hear it. The candle isn't a quaint affectation. It's a precise technical requirement. Without sunlight, the rhubarb never produces the chlorophyll that would normally turn its stalks green, leaving them instead a pale, almost luminous pink, tender, far sweeter than ordinary field-grown rhubarb, and requiring noticeably less sugar to cook palatably. Even a torch, let alone a window, would be enough to trigger exactly the greening process the entire dark room exists to prevent. So the candle stays small, the door stays shut, and anyone working in here for any length of time accepts that they are, for the duration of the harvest, essentially conducting their job by feel and faint glow, hand over hand down rows they could probably navigate blind by now anyway. The trick was discovered, as these things so often are, entirely by accident. The story comes down to us from 1817 at the Chelsea Physic Garden in London, a working botanical collection rather than a country estate, but staffed and run on broadly the same principles you've seen everywhere else in this script. Gardeners there had simply covered some leftover rhubarb roots with soil, for no more interesting reason than tidiness, and more or less forgot about them. Weeks later, somebody went back and found long, pale, sweetly flavored shoots growing up out of the dark where the roots had been buried, a complete accident, stumbled into by people who almost certainly had no idea, in the moment, that they'd just discovered a technique that would eventually define an entire regional industry. It took the rest of the century for that accident to turn into a business. By the late 1870s, growers in West Yorkshire, credited in particular to a grower named Joseph Whitwell of Leeds, had worked out how to scale the technique up properly, building purpose-built forcing sheds rather than relying on covered field plots, and discovered along the way that the specific combination of conditions in their corner of the county was close to perfect for the job. Rich, slightly acidic soil, reliably hard winter frosts to trigger the roots' dormancy properly, and crucially, cheap and plentiful coal to keep the sheds warm enough through the depths of winter to force a crop reliably, at scale, on demand. The patch of land between Leeds, Bradford, and Wakefield, where this all came together, became known, eventually, as the rhubarb triangle, and at its peak it produced something close to 90% of the entire world's supply of forced rhubarb, a genuinely staggering concentration of one extremely specific, extremely strange agricultural product in one extremely small corner of one English county. The logistics behind getting that rhubarb to market were, in their own quiet way, just as industrial as anything happening inside the sheds. The Great Northern Railway ran a dedicated overnight express service from Ardsley Station, carrying nothing but rhubarb, every weekday night throughout the forcing season, Christmas through to Easter, down to London's wholesale markets at Spitalfields and Covent Garden, in time to be on sale before the city had properly woken up. At the trade's peak before the disruption of the Second World War, as many as 200 tons of rhubarb were being moved by up to 200 different growers on a single night service, a quantity that's almost impossible to picture until you remember that every single ton of it had been grown, root by root, lifted and hauled and packed by hand, by people working in conditions of total darkness for hours at a stretch. Navigating by candlelight in rooms built specifically to deny them the one thing every other job in this script has been chasing, more light, worth knowing before you leave this building. Rhubarb's journey to the breakfast table wasn't always a culinary one at all. For a long stretch of its history in Britain, the plant was prized far more as medicine than as food, used to treat complaints of the gut, lungs, and liver, and valued highly enough that, weight for weight, it was once worth roughly 3 times the price of opium. It wasn't until forcing techniques like the one you're standing in the middle of, combined with the falling cost of sugar through the 19th century, made the stalks tender and affordable enough to be worth cooking with regularly, that rhubarb finally completed its transformation from apothecary's shelf to breakfast table, by way of the crumble, the pie, and most relevantly for the household whose garden you're currently trespassing through, the stewed compote that might, on the right winter morning, find its way onto a sideboard alongside the kippers and the marmalade. And the rhubarb shed, strange as it is, was really just the most extreme and most specialized version of a trick the rest of this garden was practicing constantly, in smaller, quieter ways. Forcing wasn't a single technique reserved for one stubborn plant. It was a whole philosophy of vegetable production, built on the same basic insight that darkness and warmth, deployed deliberately, could push a plant somewhere its own instincts would never have taken it on its own. The Victorians developed terracotta, forcing pots specifically for use in the kitchen garden proper, simple upturned jars, placed directly over a rhubarb crown growing in open ground, that achieved a smaller, gentler version of the same blanching effect, without the cost or complexity of an entire dedicated shed, useful on an estate that wanted an early crop without sacrificing the tidy, ornamental look of its beds. Sea kale, a once fashionable vegetable now almost entirely vanished from British tables, was grown specifically to be blanched white and tender under similar cover. Celery was banked up with soil as it grew, deliberately excluding light from its lower stalks to keep them pale and mild, rather than letting them turn green and bitter. And in those same backsheds behind the glasshouse range, tucked in among the tool stores and the potting benches, sat the mushroom house, another crop like the rhubarb that did its best and most valuable growing in total darkness, tended by hands that had long since learned to work by feel. Look at the kitchen garden as a whole, in other words, and a pattern starts to emerge that runs underneath everything you've seen tonight. Heat, when the climate withheld it. Darkness, when the plant's own instincts could be turned against it for a better result. Light, rationed out with as much precision as the coal that fueled the boilers. None of it was natural, exactly, or rather, all of it was natural, in the narrow sense that every trick relied on a real, unforced biological response. What wasn't natural was the deliberateness of it. A small army of skilled, underpaid people working hours that ran from well before dawn to well after dark, manipulating the most basic conditions of plant life itself, sun, frost, heat, shadow, so that a household upstairs could eat whatever it wanted, whenever it wanted, regardless of what the actual season outside the wall happened to be doing. Blow out the candle once you're back outside. Your eyes will need a minute to adjust to the ordinary gray of an actual English morning, which, after what you've just been standing in the middle of, will look almost shockingly unremarkable. It's also, for some of the people working in this garden, considerably more dangerous than it looks. The women, the boys, and the wall they couldn't climb go back to that hierarchy from a few chapters ago. Head gardener, foreman, journeyman, improver, garden boy, and you'll notice something missing from it. Women. That's not an oversight in the telling. It was an oversight built into the job itself. Women worked in Victorian kitchen gardens constantly, in real numbers, doing real and necessary labor, but almost never inside the formal ladder that let a garden boy dream, however unrealistically, of becoming a head gardener one day. At Wentworth Woodhouse in 1790, 4 of the 27 gardeners on the books were female, recorded simply as common laborers alongside the men, with no separate category created to describe what they actually did. That lack of a category is, in its own quiet way, the whole story. There wasn't a recognized female trade of gardener for the records to slot them into. There was just work that needed doing, done by women who were paid for it, and then largely written out of the profession's own memory of itself. The work these women did had a name, even if their employment status often didn't: weeding. It's one of the oldest specifically gendered roles in English garden history. Going back centuries, before Victoria was born, English court records from Rotherhithe as far back as 1354 already list women employed specifically as weeders, and a surviving 1682 contract from Kirby Hall in Northamptonshire lists payment for workmen and weeders as two distinct categories, the implication being that one was male and the other, overwhelmingly, female. By the Victorian period, the role had calcified into something close to a fixed institution: weeding women, hired seasonally, paid by the day, brought in specifically when there was more weeding to be done than the permanent male staff could keep up with, which, in a garden this size, running this many crops on this tight a schedule, was most of the growing season. The pay tells you everything about where this labor sat in the garden's internal economy. A weeding woman typically earned around half of what a male laborer was paid for comparable work, and in some recorded cases, less than that. Less, in fact, than what the garden was paying its lowest-ranked male employee, the garden boy, for work that required no more skill or strength than her own. It's worth sitting with that for a second. An adult woman, often the wife of one of the garden's own laborers, working the same beds, pulling the same weeds, sometimes being paid less than a boy who hadn't yet finished growing into his own boots. The economics of the job weren't really about the difficulty of the task. They were about who was considered to have anywhere else to be, and women, in the calculus of a Victorian estate, were assumed to have a household waiting for them regardless of what the garden was paying, so the garden didn't feel obliged to pay much. Weeding wasn't the only work that fell to women either. They were regularly given other monotonous, detail-heavy tasks the men were happy to hand off, picking caterpillars and other pests off plants by hand. Long before any chemical alternative existed, fruit gathering during the punishing intensity of the harvest season, and a role with the slightly forbidding title of bothy woman, responsible for cooking and cleaning for the unmarried male gardeners living in those cramped, cold buildings just outside the wall. The bothy women fed the men who fed the household. Nobody on either side of that arrangement was being paid particularly well for doing it. All of this work was, by design, irregular, hired by the season, the week, sometimes the day, with no security and no path upward, because there was, structurally, no upward to offer. A weeding woman could work a garden for 20 years and retire from it exactly where she started. A weeding woman, on a weeding woman's wage, with none of the title, the housing, or the modest dignity that even the lowest rung of the formal male hierarchy was entitled to. The ladder you read about earlier, boy to improver to journeyman to foreman to head gardener, simply wasn't built with a rung she could stand on. She was, in the most literal sense, working in the same garden as the ladder, while standing entirely outside it. Now go back for a moment to the boy at the very bottom of that ladder, the garden boy, the one rung that did, at least in theory, lead somewhere. It's worth getting specific about what his actual day looked like, because the broad strokes, long hours, hard labor, low pay, don't quite land the way the details do. One detailed account survives from a boy who joined the garden staff at Wentworth Woodhouse at the age of 14, and while his particular memory dates from the 1930s, The routine he describes had barely changed in shape since his grandfather's generation, and gives you the clearest available picture of exactly what this job looked like from the inside, hour by hour. His morning started with a walk to the home farm to fetch milk, which he carried to the bothy for the 14 unmarried gardeners living there. From there, he collected the copper rain gauge from the vegetable garden and carried it to the head gardener, who measured and logged the rainfall personally, every single day, rain or no rain. After that came pot washing, a steady, unglamorous task that occupied him until 11:30 in the morning. Then to the gardener's rest room, where one of his jobs was lighting the fire that would warm the men's tea bottles for their break. His own lunch, eaten somewhere in the middle of all this, was bread and jam, wrapped in a sheet of newspaper. The afternoon didn't get gentler. His first job after lunch was pushing a heavy wooden wheelbarrow out into one of the neighboring fields to collect cow dung, then wheeling the full barrow. And a barrow full of wet manure is not a light thing to push, all the way back to the glasshouses where tomatoes were grown. The dung went into sacks, the sacks went into tanks of water, and what came out the other end was the liquid fertilizer the tomato crop depended on. Other afternoons brought other regular duties, supervising the coke deliveries that fed the boiler cellars, picking and packing fruit for the house. And on Saturdays, an entirely different kind of labor altogether, polishing every brass lock and knob on every glasshouse in the garden, inside and out, because on Sunday, weather permitting, the Earl and Countess and their entourage would walk through these same gardens on their way to and from church, inspecting everything closely as they went, the gravel paths having been raked smooth specifically for their footsteps. The boy spent his Saturday making sure the family's Sunday stroll would find nothing out of place. He did not himself attend church with them. He attended to the brass. It's a genuinely strange thing to sit with, an entire week's labor, performed by a 14-year-old, organized partly around the practical needs of a tomato crop, and partly around the aesthetic comfort of an aristocratic family's weekly walk past a garden they otherwise barely looked at. The dung he carried fed the food the house ate. The brass he polished fed nothing at all except the impression, held for roughly the length of one Sunday stroll, that the whole operation ran by some kind of effortless magic, untouched by manure or coal smoke or a boy's chapped hands. Not every story that started in a bothy ended in obscurity. The most famous gardener ever to have lived in one was a young journeyman working at Windsor Castle in the early 1930s, doing essentially the job you've just read about, a few rungs further up the ladder. His name was Percy Thrower, and decades later he would become the BBC's first real television gardening celebrity, presenting Gardener's World to a national audience that had no idea, and mostly still doesn't, that the cozy, knowledgeable man on their screen had once shared a bothy with a dozen other unmarried men, doing exactly the kind of unglamorous, physically punishing apprenticeship every gardener on this estate had done before him. The latter worked, occasionally, spectacularly. It's just worth remembering, before you get too charmed by the exceptions, how many people it was built to leave exactly where they started. There's a wall standing inside this garden that nobody built out of brick, and you've just spent a chapter walking along the outside of it. The weeding women on the other side of it, paid less than a boy for the same labor. The garden boys, however hopeful, with no guarantee the latter would ever actually hold their weight. Both of them woke up before this same dawn, did work this same household depended on completely, and will, in all likelihood, never be mentioned in a single letter, ledger entry, or dinner table conversation about how lovely the garden's looking this year. It's worth knowing, too, that the work itself wasn't just hard. Some of it could kill you. The garden you've been walking through for the last 6 chapters was, behind its tidy walls and its impressive glasshouses, a genuinely dangerous place to spend your working life, and the next chapter is about exactly how and exactly who paid for it. What could kill you before the kettle boiled? Stand in this garden long enough, and you start to notice how many ways it had of hurting the people who ran it. None of it shows up in the postcards. A Victorian kitchen garden, photographed today, looks like the gentlest place imaginable, glass catching the light, fruit trees pinned neatly against warm brick, the whole scene radiating a kind of unhurried, sun-warmed calm. What that calm is actually built on is a working environment full of fire, frost, glass, gas, and poison, operated by people with no safety equipment, no employment protections worth mentioning, and in the case of the youngest workers, barely enough life experience to know which of the dangers around them deserve to be taken seriously. Start with fire, because fire was everywhere in this garden, all the time by design. Every boiler you've already heard breathing through these walls was an open invitation to disaster if handled badly, and handling it badly was always one exhausted, half-asleep mistake away. Furnace doors ran hot enough to burn an unprotected hand on contact. Pipes carrying heated water through the glasshouse ranges could scald just as effectively as any kitchen range, and they ran everywhere, under floor gratings, along back walls, through narrow service passages, where a tired man working by lamplight had every opportunity to brush against one without meaning to. The men who tended these systems through the night, feeding coal or coke into furnaces hour after hour to keep the pineries and vineries at the precise, unforgiving temperatures their tropical contents demanded, were doing a job that combined the worst aspects of a stoker's life with the worst aspects of a farmhand's, heavy, filthy, repetitive labor carried out in the dark, with the constant low-grade risk of a burn, a scald, or, if a flue blocked and smoke backed up into an enclosed space rather than escaping up the chimney as intended, something considerably worse than a burn. Then there was the opposite problem, and in some ways the more relentless one, cold. For every hour spent sweating next to a furnace, there were just as many spent entirely without one, out in the open garden through the depths of an English winter, doing work that simply couldn't wait for warmer weather, lifting rhubarb roots out of frozen ground, pruning fruit trees against walls cold enough to ache through a glove, hauling barrows of manure and coke across yards turned to mud and then to ice. The working hours you read about earlier didn't soften for January. They shortened slightly, from 60-odd hours a week to something closer to 50, and that was the entire concession the season was granted. Frostbite, chapped and cracked hands, the kind of chronic joint pain that comes from decades of heavy outdoor labor in damp cold. None of it was dramatic enough to make it into a ledger as an accident, and so none of it survives in the record with anything like the clarity of an injury that actually stopped someone working for a day. It just accumulated, year after year, in the bodies of men whose later lives we mostly don't have any record of at all. Glass added its own particular, very literal kind of danger. An estate with a third of its kitchen garden under glasshouse roofing was, among other things, sitting on an enormous and continuously vulnerable surface area of a material that shatters. Hailstorms could and did destroy panes by the dozen in a matter of minutes, leaving gardeners to clear and replace broken glass, often still in the middle of whatever storm had caused the damage, because a glasshouse with a hole in its roof on a freezing night could lose an entire season's painstakingly forced crop before morning. Cuts from broken glass were common enough to be simply part of the job's background noise, not the kind of injury anyone wrote home about, but the kind that, repeated often enough across a working lifetime, left most experienced gardeners with hands that told their own quiet history, scar by scar, long before they ever reached for a pen to write any of it down. And then there was the pest control, which deserves its own honest reckoning, because the Victorians were fighting an unglamorous, near-constant war against insects and disease inside their glasshouses, and the weapons they reached for were, by any modern standard, alarming. Sulfur was burned directly inside sealed glasshouses to fumigate them, an effective way of killing off aphids and other pests, and an equally effective way of filling an enclosed space with sulfur dioxide, a gas that does serious damage to human lungs in any concentration worth calling effective against an insect. Someone had to seal that glasshouse up, light the sulfur, wait the necessary hours, and then go back in to ventilate it and clear up. And the protective equipment available to that someone amounted, in practice, to holding your breath and working fast. Tobacco smoke was used the same way, burned or smoldered inside closed structures specifically to drive out pests with fumes irritating enough to do the job, fumes that didn't, of course, distinguish between an insect's respiratory system and a gardener's. This was the same broader period in British life when arsenic-based compounds, used everywhere from wallpaper pigment to dress dye to, increasingly, agricultural pest control, were quietly accumulating in the bodies of the people who worked with them daily, long before the wider public, or in many cases the workers themselves, fully understood what they were breathing or touching. A Victorian gardener spraying, dusting, or fumigating against pests was operating in exactly that blind spot, doing necessary, sanctioned work with substances that the era's own science hadn't yet caught up to. None of this, it has to be said plainly, was unique to gardening. Victorian Britain was, across nearly every trade, a genuinely dangerous place to earn a living, and a gardener's risks, burns, frostbite, glass, toxic fumes, the simple grinding wear of decades of heavy physical work, were, if anything, milder than what awaited a miner, a mill worker, or a chimney sweep. That's worth holding on to, rather than overstating the garden's dangers into something they weren't. But it's also worth resisting the opposite mistake, the comfortable modern habit of imagining the walled garden as a pastoral idyll, gently removed from the genuine harshness of industrial Victorian labor, when in truth it was simply industrial labor that happened to be dressed in leaves. There's one story, though, that cuts through all of this in a way no general description of hazards quite manages to, and it comes, fittingly, from the very career this whole script keeps circling back to. Between 1835 and 1839, while Joseph Paxton was deep into the early triumphs of his time at Chatsworth, the arboretum taking shape, the rock garden under construction, the forcing frames going up for the espaliers and the pineapples, he was also organizing plant hunting expeditions, sending men out from the estate to track down new and exotic specimens to bring back for the Duke's collection. This was, by the standards of the time, a perfectly ordinary thing for an ambitious head gardener to do. Plant hunting was a genuine and respected branch of the horticultural trade, and bringing home a species nobody else in England had successfully grown was exactly the kind of achievement that built a garden's reputation and a gardener's alongside it. One of those expeditions went to California. And two of the gardeners Paxton sent, men who had presumably stood in exactly the kind of bothy you read about a couple of chapters ago, who had presumably worked their way up through exactly the kind of apprenticeship that built every career in this story, drowned there, on the far side of the world, in the course of a job that had sent them out to find a plant. Their names do not appear in most of the accounts of Paxton's life that survive. The history remembers the Great Conservatory. It remembers the Lily House, the Crystal Palace, the knighthood that followed. It records, almost as an aside in a single clipped sentence, that one of the plant hunting expeditions ended in tragedy when two gardeners from Chatsworth sent to California drowned, and then moves straight on to the next achievement, because that's simply how these stories tend to get told. The men themselves, the actual human cost of one single line in one single expedition's outcome, vanish almost entirely from the record the moment they're mentioned. It's worth sitting with that, rather than rushing past it the way the history books generally do. Somewhere in California, in the late 1830s, two men who had given their working lives to a garden in Derbyshire died a very long way from home, doing a job that existed entirely to make that garden more impressive, more famous, more worth visiting. Nobody at Chatsworth's breakfast table that morning had any reason to know it had happened. Most of the people who later marveled at the Lily House, or stood inside the Great Conservatory, or stared up at the Crystal Palace itself, never learned it either. The cost of this particular kind of ambition was real, was fatal, and was almost entirely invisible to everyone who got to enjoy the result. That's not a reason to think less of Paxton, particularly sending men out into the world to find new plants was, again, simply how the profession worked, and the risk those men accepted was a risk plenty of skilled tradesmen of the era accepted in pursuit of opportunities a farm laborer's son could never otherwise have reached. But it is a reason to be honest about what sits underneath every triumphant story this script is about to tell. The Great Conservatory you're about to read about in the next chapter, the building that eventually grew into the single most famous structure of the entire Victorian age, was built by a man whose career, like the garden itself, like the breakfast table at the end of all of this, was never as gentle underneath as it looked from the outside. Keep that in mind as you walk toward the glasshouses ahead. They're about to get very impressive indeed. The Lily, the Conservatory, and the Crystal Palace by 1836, the boy who had once climbed a kitchen garden wall in the dark, had been head gardener at Chatsworth for a decade, and the Duke who'd hired him had developed, under Paxton's quiet encouragement, an increasingly serious passion for the most exotic plants money could acquire, orchids above all, but increasingly anything rare enough to be worth the trouble of keeping alive in Derbyshire. The Duke wanted somewhere to put all of it. Paxton built him the largest glass building in Europe. It was called, in the slightly theatrical shorthand of the period, the Great Stove, stove being a carryover term from Dutch horticultural practice, where gardeners had been the first in Europe to work out that subtropical plants needed more than light. They needed sustained artificial heat to survive a northern winter at all. What Paxton built between 1836 and 1840 took that basic Dutch insight and scaled it up to something nobody in England had previously attempted. The structure stretched some 277 feet, long enough, famously, that a horse-drawn carriage could be driven straight through its central aisle, which on at least one occasion it was, when Queen Victoria herself was driven through the conservatory while it blazed with 12,000 lamps for the occasion. 8 separate boilers, connected by roughly 7 miles of iron pipe, kept the interior climate stable enough to support an entire collection of plants that, by any reasonable measure, had no business growing in this country at all. The whole undertaking cost in excess of £30,000, a sum that would have paid the wages of Chatsworth's entire garden workforce, head gardener included, for decades. The roof Paxton designed for it, a ridge and furrow pattern, a repeating series of small angled peaks rather than one continuous slope, wasn't decorative. It was a direct, carefully calculated response to the specific angle of the morning and evening sun, designed to catch as much usable light as possible across the longest stretch of the day, an approach so effective that it became the basic template for greenhouse roofing for the rest of the century and beyond. But the genuinely radical insight Paxton brought to the project wasn't really about catching heat at all. It was about controlling it. Most growers of the period, working from instinct rather than experiment, assumed that since exotic plants came from hot countries, the answer was simply to keep their glasshouses as hot as physically possible, all the time, no matter the cost in fuel or the strain on the plants themselves. Paxton, through years of patient observation in exactly the kind of glasshouse you walked through several chapters ago, had reached a different and considerably more sophisticated conclusion. That ventilation, the deliberate, controlled release of excess heat, mattered just as much as the heat itself, and that orchids and other supposedly delicate exotics, given proper airflow alongside their warmth, grew noticeably better than they did sealed permanently into an airless tropical oven. It's a small, almost technical-sounding insight. It's also, in its quiet way, the same instinct that had let a 15-year-old farm laborer's son outthink dukes and professional architects his entire career, pay closer attention to the actual evidence than anyone else bothers to, and trust what you find over what everyone already assumes. Around the same period, Paxton's other great horticultural triumph at Chatsworth was rather less architecturally ambitious and rather more strange. A single banana plant, purchased for £10, which he raised through the 1830s on nothing more sophisticated than plenty of water-rich loam soil, and in his own description of the method, well-rotted dung. It flowered in November 1835, winning a medal at the Horticultural Society for the achievement, and the variety Paxton coaxed into fruit at Chatsworth was given the name Musa Cavendishii, in honor of the Duke's own family name. Today, under the slightly shortened name Cavendish, it is the single most widely eaten variety of banana on Earth, the one sitting in your kitchen fruit bowl right now, in all likelihood, descends in cultivated lineage from a plant a Victorian gardener grew, essentially as a hobby, alongside everything else he had going on at the time, in a garden in Derbyshire. But the project that would eventually outgrow everything else Paxton ever built started, like so much of this story, with a seed that simply refused to behave the way anyone expected. In 1836, seeds of a genuinely enormous species of Amazonian water lily, Victoria regia, named, like so much that decade, for the Queen, were sent back to England and given to Kew Gardens to germinate. They grew well enough. They simply would not flower year after year, despite the best efforts of some of the most accomplished botanists in the country. In 1849, with the plant still stubbornly refusing to bloom, a seedling was handed over to Paxton at Chatsworth, on the strength of his reputation alone, essentially as a last resort. He entrusted the actual day-to-day care of it to a young gardener on his staff named Eduard Ortjes, another name worth pausing on, another junior member of staff who did the hands-on work behind an achievement that history would eventually credit almost entirely to his employer. Within 2 months under Ortjes's care, the lily's leaves had grown to 4.5 feet across. A month after that, it flowered, the first time the species had ever bloomed successfully anywhere in England. It kept growing. Within a remarkably short stretch of time, the plant had genuinely outgrown the building it was being kept in, and Paxton found himself designing an entirely new structure purely to house one increasingly enormous water lily, the Lily House, also known as the Victoria Regia House. What's remarkable about this particular building isn't really its size, which was modest compared to the Great Stove. It's where the engineering came from. Paxton became fascinated by the structural logic of the lily's own enormous leaves, a natural feat of engineering, in his own later description of it, and specifically, by the way, a network of radiating ribs, connected by a web of more flexible cross ribs, gave each leaf enough rigidity to support real weight without buckling under it. To prove the point, in a piece of theater that has survived as one of the most charming anecdotes in the entire history of Victorian botany, he floated his young daughter Annie directly on top of one of the lily's leaves, out on the water, fully supported, while the leaf simply held her weight without so much as flexing. That structural principle, radiating ribs, cross-braced for flexible rigidity, scaled up from a single floating leaf into an entire load-bearing roof, became the architectural seed of everything Paxton built afterward. He developed a flat-roofed variant of his ridge and furrow glazing for the Lily House, along with a new curtain wall system that let vertical bays of glass hang directly from cantilevered beams rather than relying on a heavier, more conventional supporting frame. Years of patient, iterative experimentation across both buildings, the Great Stove and the Lily House together, gradually built up exactly the design vocabulary Paxton would need for the project that finally, genuinely, made him a household name across the entire country. That project arrived, characteristically, almost by accident. By 1850, Britain was trying, and largely failing, to solve a specific and very public architectural problem. What kind of building could possibly house the Great Exhibition, an unprecedented international showcase of industry and manufacturing that the organizing commission wanted to stage in Hyde Park the following year? An open international design competition had produced 245 separate submissions, and the commission's building committee had rejected essentially all of them as impractical, too slow to build, or too permanent for a site everyone agreed needed to be restored to parkland once the exhibition closed. In the absence of anything better, the committee had drawn up its own fallback design, a vast brick building topped with an enormous cast iron dome, contributed in large part by the celebrated engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel. It was, by nearly every account from the period, deeply unpopular. The public objected to the prospect of a huge, permanent brick structure disfiguring one of London's most cherished parks. Parliament objected. The whole project, with its opening date already fixed and rapidly approaching, was on the verge of becoming a genuine national embarrassment. Paxton, at this point, was in London on entirely unrelated business in his capacity, by now, as a director of the Midland Railway, meeting its chairman about railway matters that had nothing to do with horticulture or exhibitions at all. He mentioned in conversation that he had an idea for the exhibition hall. He was encouraged, more or less on the spot, to put something on paper, provided he could manage it within about 9 days, an absurdly tight deadline for a building of this scale, by a man who, on top of everything else demanding his time, was still technically the working head gardener of one of the largest estates in England. 2 days later, on the 11th of June, 1850, sitting in a routine Midland Railway Board meeting in Derby, half listening to business that had nothing to do with glass or gardens, Paxton picked up the only paper within reach, a sheet of pink blotting paper, and began to sketch. By the end of the meeting, he had produced the essential outline of what would become the Crystal Palace, a side elevation and a cross-section drawn in a few unhurried minutes, built directly on the structural logic of the Lily House he'd already spent years perfecting at Chatsworth. That scrap of blotting paper survives today in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it is, by every account of people who have examined it since, startlingly close to the finished building, proof, if any more were needed at this point in his life, that Paxton's mind had simply finished solving this particular problem years before anyone formally asked him to. He had detailed plans, calculations, and costings ready within the agreed window. The commission's hesitation notwithstanding, there was real resistance at first, since a rival design was already further along in the official planning process. Paxton, characteristically unwilling to simply wait for institutional caution to catch up with him, sidestepped the committee entirely and published his design directly in the Illustrated London News. Public reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly favorable, and the commission formally adopted his scheme in July 1850, helped along considerably by an unusually competitive construction bid from the engineering firm Fox, Henderson and Company. What followed was one of the most genuinely remarkable construction projects of the entire 19th century. Paxton had, depending on which account you read, somewhere between 8 months and just under a year to design in full detail, manufacture every component of, and physically erect the largest glass structure the world had ever seen on a fixed opening date that could not move, in a public park that needed to look essentially untouched once the whole thing was eventually dismantled. He met the deadline. The finished building ran somewhere around 1,848 feet long, close to a third of a mile, at a height of over 100 feet, built using roughly 4,500 tons of iron and more than 250,000 individual panes of glass, supplied by the Chance Brothers Glassworks in such bulk that the company had to bring in additional labor from France simply to manufacture enough sheet glass in time. Glazing moved along the structure on specially designed trolleys, fast enough that a single skilled worker could fix over 100 panes of glass in a single day. Roughly 2,000 men built the entire thing in well under a year, on schedule, for a final cost of under £80,000, a fraction of what a conventional masonry building of comparable scale and grandeur would have required, and a powerful, very public demonstration of exactly the kind of cheap, fast, modular, prefabricated construction that Paxton had been quietly refining, one glasshouse at a time, in a Derbyshire kitchen garden for the better part of 2 decades. There's one detail from the design process worth lingering on, because it captures something genuinely characteristic about how Paxton's mind worked. Hyde Park, the chosen site, already had several large, mature elm trees standing exactly where the building's footprint needed to go, and removing them had become, alongside the brick and dome design itself, one of the most politically sensitive sticking points for an exhibition that already had a vocal and determined opposition lobby looking for any excuse to derail it. Rather than felling the trees or redesigning around them in some awkward compromise, Paxton simply altered his plans shortly before construction began, adding a soaring, barrel-vaulted transept across the center of the building, set at right angles to the main gallery, tall enough to enclose the existing elms entirely within the finished structure. The trees that had threatened to sink the entire project ended up standing, alive and undisturbed, inside one of the most famous buildings ever constructed, a piece of genuinely elegant problem solving from a man whose entire working life, going all the way back to that first morning climbing over a locked garden wall, had been built on the simple habit of finding a way through rather than around. The Great Exhibition opened on the 1st of May, 1851, and ran for 5.5 months, drawing more than 6 million visitors through doors that by any honest measure had been designed by a gardener. The building itself, clear-walled, daylit, requiring no interior lighting at all during the hours it was open, was, by most contemporary accounts, considered every bit as remarkable an exhibit as anything actually on display inside it. Paxton was knighted that year, alongside the structural engineer Charles Fox and the building committee's chairman William Cubitt, in formal recognition of what the three of them had achieved together. A farm laborer's youngest son, who had started his working life at 15 carrying tools for a baronet's gardener, who had once scaled a locked wall in the dark because nobody had thought to give him a key, was now Sir Joseph Paxton, and the building that had earned him the title was, by some distance, the most talked about structure on the planet. It didn't end there, either, not for the man and not for the building. After the exhibition closed, the Crystal Palace was dismantled, purchased by a consortium of businessmen, and rebuilt on a far larger and more permanent scale at Sydenham in South London, where it remained a major public attraction. The surrounding district still carries its name to this day, until it was destroyed by fire in 1936, 70 years after Paxton's own death. Paxton himself, having proven that a head gardener's skill set could apparently encompass architecture, structural engineering, and large-scale project management without missing a step, simply kept adding to the list. He served as a Liberal Member of Parliament for Coventry from 1854 until his death, sat on the Kew Commission advising on improvements to the Royal Botanic Gardens, and in 1855 presented an extraordinarily ambitious proposal to Parliament called the Great Victorian Way, a 10-mile arcaded loop around the centre of London, built using Crystal Palace-style glass and iron construction, intended to incorporate a roadway, an early form of atmospheric railway, and housing and shops all under one continuous covered structure. It was never built. Reading the description of it now, more than a century and a half later, in a city that still argues about how to cover its own roads and railways, It's hard not to notice how far ahead of his moment Paxton's instincts genuinely were. He remained, remarkably, the working head gardener at Chatsworth through almost all of this, through the Great Exhibition, through his time in Parliament, through his other major commissions, including the design of Mentmore Towers in Buckinghamshire for Baron Mayer de Rothschild, one of the grandest country houses built anywhere in England during the entire Victorian period. He only gave up the Chatsworth post in 1858, following the death of the 6th Duke, the same man who, more than 3 decades earlier, had liked the way a young foreman spoke clearly enough for a deaf man to follow, and had offered him, on that basis, the chance that started everything. The bulk of Paxton's eventual personal fortune, it's worth noting plainly, came not from his salary as head gardener, generous as that salary was by the standards of his trade, but from successful speculation in the railway industry during one of the great speculative booms of the century. A reminder that even Paxton's own remarkable rise was shaped, in the end, by exactly the kind of financial luck and timing that no amount of talent alone reliably produces. His health began to decline in 1863, and he died at his home in Sydenham on the 8th of June, 1865, not far from the relocated Crystal Palace that had made him famous. He was buried by his own evident wish, not in London among the institutions that had knighted and celebrated him, but back at Chatsworth, in the churchyard at Edensor, the same estate village he had personally helped rebuild decades earlier, on the same grounds where he'd once climbed a locked wall in the dark as an anonymous 23-year-old with nothing to his name but a coach ticket and a duke's verbal promise. Sarah Paxton outlived him by 6 years, remaining at their house on the Chatsworth estate until her own death in 1871, and it's worth closing this chapter with her rather than with him, because so much of what made Paxton's career possible ran through a woman whose name appears nowhere on the Great Stove, nowhere on the Lily House, nowhere on the Crystal Palace, and almost nowhere in the popular memory of any of it. The archive of letters between them that survives at Chatsworth today, something close to 2,000 individual pieces of correspondence, makes plain just how much of the actual, day-to-day running of the gardens fell to Sarah whenever Joseph's other ambitions pulled him away, which by the 1840s and 1850s was constantly. She managed the foremen. She gave direct instructions to the men working under her husband's official title. She possessed, by every account that survives her, a genuinely sophisticated understanding of the plants, the finances, and the practical operation of one of the most demanding gardens in the country, understanding she put to use for decades, almost entirely off the record, so that her husband could spend his time sketching glass buildings on blotting paper in railway boardrooms. It is, in its own way, exactly the same imbalance you read about a couple of chapters ago, just dressed in considerably finer clothes. The weeding woman in the kitchen garden paid less than a boy for pulling the same weeds. The head gardener's wife, running an entire estate's horticultural operation from behind the scenes while her husband collected the knighthood. Different rungs of the same ladder, the same fundamental arithmetic underneath both of them. The work got done, the credit went elsewhere, and the historical record, left to its own devices, remembered exactly the version of events that flattered the people it was already inclined to flatter. None of which erases what Paxton actually built, or what his life actually proves about the latter this script keeps circling back to. It's simply worth remembering, walking away from the most spectacular success story in this entire script, that even the cleanest version of social mobility Victorian Britain had to offer still ran, underneath, on labor that history barely bothered to name. Whether that labor belonged to two drowned gardeners in California, a 14-year-old boy polishing brass for a Sunday inspection, or the wife managing 2,000 letters worth of an empire her husband got to sign. There's one more thread to follow before this garden's morning is finished, and it has nothing to do with glass or fame at all. It's about what was actually arriving at the breakfast table, where it came from, and just how far the empire reached to put a single jar of something sweet next to the toast. Sugar, empire, and the jar on the table, not everything on this breakfast sideboard, grew inside the wall you've spent the last 9 chapters climbing over, lurking behind, and learning to fear. Some of it traveled considerably further than a kitchen garden ever could across oceans, through wars, and through a global trade network that makes the pineapple pit look almost quaint by comparison. To understand the full cost of a Victorian breakfast, you have to follow a few of these items all the way back to where they actually came from, and the story, more often than not, gets considerably darker the further back you go. Start with the jar sitting closest to the toast rack, marmalade, and specifically the version that, by the second half of the 19th century, had become so dominant that Dundee marmalade was practically a generic term for the stuff, the way champagne eventually became shorthand for any sparkling wine, whether it came from the right region of France or not. The story Kaler's own family told about its origins has the satisfying shape of a legend, which is usually a sign that at least some of it is exactly that. According to the version passed down for generations, sometime in the late 18th century, a Spanish ship loaded with Seville oranges was forced to shelter from a storm in the harbor at Dundee, on Scotland's east coast. The delay had left the cargo past its best. Seville oranges are intensely bitter even when perfectly fresh, more useful at the time for medicine than for eating, and the ship's captain, eager to recoup something rather than nothing on a cargo nobody particularly wanted, sold the lot cheaply to a local grocer named James Kaler. His mother, Janet, took the bargain oranges and set about working out what, if anything, could be done with several hundredweight of fruit too bitter for almost anyone to want to eat. The truth underneath the legend is somewhat less cinematic and somewhat more interesting. Marmalade itself long predated the Kalers by centuries. The word comes from the Portuguese marmelo, meaning quince, and sweetened quince and citrus preserves had existed across Spain and Portugal since at least the 15th century, with Scottish recipes for orange marmalade already circulating in print by 1736. What Janet Kaler actually contributed around 1797 wasn't the invention of marmalade itself, but a specific and genuinely clever reformulation of it. Rather than discarding the bitter orange peel entirely, the way most existing recipes did, she shredded it into thin strips and suspended those strips directly in the finished preserve, creating what came to be called chip marmalade, visibly different from anything that had come before, distinctly more bitter and complex in flavor, and crucially reformulated from a stiff, quince jelly-like paste into something soft and spreadable enough to actually go on a slice of toast. That last change, small as it sounds, was the one that mattered most. Once marmalade could be spread rather than sliced, it had a natural home, and that home was breakfast. The business the Kalers built around this reformulated recipe grew, over the following century, into something close to an industrial operation. By the mid-19th century, the firm was importing some 3,000 chests of bitter Seville oranges annually, each chest weighing roughly 200 weight, and turning that raw fruit into something approaching 1,000 tons of finished marmalade a year, packed into roughly 1.5 million 1-pound stoneware pots, alongside a considerable quantity of larger jars sold to institutions and grocers in bulk. Production had expanded well beyond India itself by this point, with a second facility operating in St. Peter Port on Guernsey, in the Channel Islands, handling a substantial share of total output through the 1860s and 1870s. In 1876, when Britain's new Trademark Registry Act came into force, Kaler's Dundee Orange Marmalade was among the very first brands in the country to be formally registered, a small but telling sign of just how thoroughly the product had come to dominate its category, and of how seriously the family had come to guard the recognizable name behind it. And the marmalade didn't stay in Britain. It traveled outward through exactly the channels you'd expect of a confident, expanding Victorian export business, riding the same imperial trade networks that were simultaneously moving tea, sugar, and rubber in the opposite direction, into India, into South Africa, into Australia and New Zealand, into Canadian and American grocers stocking a small taste of home for British expatriates and an aspirational taste of Britishness for everyone else. A jar of Dundee marmalade sitting on a breakfast sideboard in Calcutta or Cape Town in 1880 wasn't simply a foodstuff. It was a small, edible piece of imperial identity, manufactured in Scotland, shipped on the same lines that carried administrators, soldiers, and the entire apparatus of British rule to wherever it happened to be needed next. Sitting next to that jar of marmalade, in all likelihood, was a pot of tea, and the story behind that particular drink is, on close inspection, considerably less comfortable than the marmalades. For roughly 2 centuries, China held an effective global monopoly on tea production, and Britain's appetite for the drink had grown, by the early 19th century, into one of the central facts of the entire British economy. The problem from a British trading perspective was straightforward and stark. China wanted relatively little of what Britain produced in return, and was perfectly happy to take payment in silver, which steadily drained out of the British economy in exchange for tea that British consumers, by this point, regarded as an absolute domestic necessity rather than a luxury at all. The solution: the East India Company arrived at grow opium in British-controlled India and sell it into China, whether the Chinese government wanted it sold there or not, triggered 2 genuinely brutal wars in the middle of the century, and remains one of the more openly shameful chapters in the entire history of British imperial trade, fought, in the most literal sense, to keep British breakfast tables supplied with their morning cup. Britain's eventual solution to its dependence on Chinese tea was almost as audacious as the opium trade itself, if considerably less violent in its immediate execution. In the 1840s, a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune, already well known in horticultural circles for an earlier expedition to China that had captured the Victorian public's imagination, was recruited specifically to travel back into the country's interior at real personal risk and acquire tea plants, seeds, and the closely guarded cultivation knowledge that went with them, all of it intended for transplantation into British-controlled India. He succeeded. Within a remarkably short span of years, tea cultivation, grown using stolen Chinese stock and techniques, and worked by cheap colonial Indian labor, had been established at a scale large enough that India eventually overtook China as the world's largest tea-producing country altogether. A shift so complete and so lasting that China, by some measures, has never fully recovered its former dominance of the Western tea market, even in the century and a half since. Getting that tea, whether still coming from China in the earlier decades of the century, or increasingly from India as the century wore on, from the point of harvest to a teapot on an English breakfast sideboard, was itself a race against time, and a genuinely dramatic one. Once the East India Company's monopoly on the China trade ended in 1834, merchants competed fiercely to be first into London with each new season's freshest crop, and that competition produced one of the more romantic footnotes of Victorian commerce. The tea clippers, purpose-built sailing ships engineered purely for speed, racing one another across roughly 15,000 nautical miles of open ocean for the considerable financial premium awarded to whichever ship docked first with the new season's tea. The most famous of these races, in 1866, came down to a near photo finish between two ships named Teeping and Ariel, arriving in London within roughly half an hour of each other after months at sea, close enough that the prize money was eventually split between them by mutual agreement of their owners, rather than risk an argument over who technically won. It is, by any measure, a thrilling piece of maritime history. It is also worth remembering that the entire spectacle existed purely to satisfy a domestic drink habit that had itself been built, a century earlier, on opium smuggled into a country that didn't want it, and would shortly come to rely just as heavily on the second half of its essential pairing, sugar, whose own history is darker still. Tea, on its own, is a fairly austere drink. What turned it into the all-day British ritual it became was sugar, and the supply of sugar, cheap and plentiful enough to sweeten a national drinking habit, came overwhelmingly, for most of the 18th and well into the 19th century, from plantations in the Caribbean worked by enslaved African labor, under conditions of violence and mortality that remain genuinely difficult to read about even at 2 centuries distance. Britain formally abolished slavery across most of its empire in 1833, a handful of years before Victoria herself took the throne, but the economic machinery built on that earlier brutality didn't simply vanish the moment the law changed. Sugar production in the Caribbean shifted, in the decades that followed, toward indentured labor, drawn in large numbers from India and China under contracts that were nominally voluntary, and in practice, frequently exploitative in ways that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to what they'd technically replaced. By the time a Victorian household stirred a spoonful of sugar into its morning tea, that sugar carried behind it a century and a half of slavery, followed by decades of a labor system explicitly designed to keep the plantations running once slavery itself had finally been made illegal. None of that history was visible in the sugar bowl. All of it was nonetheless sitting right there on the table, dissolved invisibly into a drink nobody at breakfast thought twice about. It's worth pausing here, honestly, rather than rushing past it the way a breakfast conversation certainly would have. Nobody sitting down to toast and marmalade in 1870 was thinking about the Opium Wars or about indentured cane cutters in the West Indies, any more than you, pouring your own coffee this morning, were thinking about the specific conditions on the farm that grew it. That's not a coincidence, and it's not really a failure of individual character either. It's what a sufficiently large and sufficiently well-organized supply chain is actually for, to take something built on real human cost, somewhere far away, and deliver it to a breakfast table looking entirely ordinary, entirely innocent, entirely disconnected from wherever it actually came from. The Victorian breakfast table did this about as thoroughly as any meal in human history ever has. Ours mostly still does. Not everything traveling this far was quite so weighed down with history, though plenty of it still carried at least a trace of empire in its flavor. Kedgeree, a dish of flaked smoked fish, rice, and curried spicing, derived from an Indian original called kikri and adapted by British residents and returning colonial administrators into something suitable for an English breakfast sideboard, became a genuinely fashionable item on country house tables by the second half of the century, a small, edible souvenir of imperial service that quietly normalized the taste of curry spices for a domestic audience that, in almost every other context, would have regarded them as thoroughly foreign. Finnan haddie, haddock smoked over peat in the Scottish fishing village tradition that gave the dish its name, made the journey from coastal Scotland rather than colonial India, but followed much the same basic pattern, a regional speciality, transported, adapted, and eventually adopted widely enough to become, by Victoria's own reported preference for it, fit for a queen's breakfast table. Stand back from all of it, the marmalade, the tea, the sugar, the kedgeree, and a single, fairly uncomfortable picture starts to come into focus. The walled garden behind you has shown you one entire hidden economy, local, walkable, built on coal and manure, and the labor of people who never left the estate. But the moment you step from the garden's produce to the rest of what's actually arriving on this sideboard, the hidden economy turns out to be very nearly the size of the entire planet. A single Victorian breakfast table was, without any exaggeration, a confluence of forced rhubarb grown 20 miles away and opium-financed tea grown on the other side of the world, of a pineapple raised in horse manure 100 yards from the house and sugar cut by indentured laborers 4,000 miles away in the Caribbean, of a gardener's 8-year apprenticeship and a botanist's theft of state secrets from an empire that didn't want to give them up. None of it was visible from the dining chair. That, more than anything else in this entire script, is the actual point. The sun is properly up now. The bell that rang at 4:30 has long since stopped meaning anything to anyone except the people who heard it. Somewhere above you, in a bedroom that's been warm all night thanks to a fire someone else got up early to light, the family this entire morning has been organized around is finally beginning to stir. It's time to go inside and watch them eat. Orchid lyrium and the plant hunters who never came home. There's a glasshouse on this estate you haven't been inside yet, and it isn't growing anything anyone is going to eat. Step into it and the air changes again, wetter this time, heavier, closer to a real jungle than anything you've stood in tonight so far. Pale roots hang loose in the air. Strange, waxy flowers sit on plants that don't look, to an untrained eye, like they should be capable of producing a flower at all. This is the orchid house, and what's growing in it represents, pound for pound, very probably the single most expensive collection of living things anywhere on the entire estate, considerably more valuable, plant for plant, than the pinery you walked through several chapters ago, and arguably more dangerous to acquire than anything else you've encountered tonight. The craze behind this room has a real point of origin, and it's a wonderfully Victorian kind of accident. In the early 1800s, a British naturalist named William John Swainson busy shipping a consignment of exotic plants home from Brazil, packed some unfamiliar specimens around the cargo simply to cushion it. He assumed, reasonably enough at the time, that the strange, leafless-looking things he was using as packing material were worthless weeds. They were orchids. By the time the shipment arrived in Britain, several of them had, despite the indignity of their journey, burst into spectacular flower, and the effect on everyone who saw them was immediate and lasting. Within a few decades, orchid fever, a condition the Victorians themselves eventually nicknamed orchidlerium, had become one of the genuine speculative manias of the 19th century, comparable in its own era to the Dutch tulip bubble of 2 centuries earlier, except that this particular bubble never really fully popped. It just gradually, quietly deflated, decade by decade, as cultivation techniques finally caught up with demand. The economics of orchid collecting at its peak were close to absurd. Specimens considered especially rare or especially beautiful could sell at auction for hundreds of pounds. A single plant of the striking blue Vanda caerulea fetched around £300 at the height of the mania, a sum equivalent to tens of thousands of pounds today for one orchid. At the very peak of speculative frenzy, a single leaf from an exceptionally desirable plant might sell for a guinea, only for the entire species to crash to a fraction of a shilling within a season or two, the moment a successful expedition flooded the market with fresh specimens. Wealthy collectors, dukes, industrialists, anyone with the resources and the inclination, competed every bit as fiercely over orchids as Georgian aristocrats had once competed over pineapples, and the nurseries that served them, firms like Loddige's and the Veitch family business, built entire commercial empires on sponsoring expeditions to track down whatever new and spectacular specimen might capture the market's attention next. Getting an orchid from a rainforest canopy in South America or Southeast Asia into an English glasshouse without it dying en route was, for most of the craze's early history, a genuinely difficult technical problem, solved only in 1829 when a botanist named Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward developed what became known as the Wardian case, essentially a sealed miniature glasshouse small enough to travel in a ship's hold, capable of maintaining a stable, humid microclimate for weeks at sea without anyone needing to open it. The same invention that made orchid collecting commercially viable also, almost as a side effect, ignited a second, slightly less expensive plant mania of its own, pteridymania, or fern fever, as ordinary middle-class households discovered that ferns, too, could now survive the journey from somewhere exotic into somebody's parlor. Between the two crazes, a remarkable share of Victorian Britain's collective attention, money, and risk tolerance ended up devoted to plants that, by any sober economic measure, did absolutely nothing for anyone except sit there and look extraordinary. The risk tolerance is the part worth dwelling on because it wasn't the collectors back home who actually carried any of it. It was the men they sent out to do the finding. A successful career as a professional orchid hunter meant months, sometimes years, spent deep in territory the hunter usually didn't speak the language of, climbing the kind of trees nobody sane climbs without a very good reason, navigating terrain that hadn't been mapped with anything close to accuracy, and doing all of it while permanently exposed to malaria, yellow fever, and the blood disease known at the time as blackwater fever, any one of which could and regularly did end a hunter's career and his life in the same illness. Add to that the more mundane physical dangers of falls, snake bites, drowning, and the genuinely large predators sharing the same forests as the orchids, and you have a profession with a mortality rate that would be considered entirely unacceptable in almost any other line of work a Victorian gentleman might consider respectable. Plant hunting, by the standards of its own era, generally was considered respectable, even romantic. Nobody back in England, admiring a freshly imported cattleya in somebody's drawing room, was thinking especially hard about what it had taken to get there. Competition between rival hunters, working for rival nurseries, chasing the same lucrative new species, occasionally turned dangerous in its own right, independent of anything the jungle itself was doing. One well-documented account describes two competing orchid hunters, both bound for the same patch of Brazilian forest aboard the same ship, getting into an argument fierce enough that firearms came out, and the encounter very nearly ended in a duel before anyone backed down. Some hunters, having located a particularly valuable population of a desirable species, would deliberately strip or destroy what remained of it after taking what they needed, purely to prevent a rival hunter from profiting off the same find. An act of pure commercial sabotage that multiplied across an entire industry, operating this way for the better part of a century. Did genuine and lasting damage to wild orchid populations across huge stretches of South America and Southeast Asia, decades before anyone in Europe had any real framework for thinking about that kind of damage as a problem worth solving. This is, in other words, the exact same engine you've already watched running once in this script, just with a different fuel and a higher body count. The pineapple chapter showed you how status, once it attaches itself firmly enough to a single object, can justify almost any amount of expense, infrastructure, and labor, all of it invisible to the guest admiring the result on a dinner table. Orchidlerium ran on precisely the same logic, scaled up considerably, with the labor involved no longer confined to a manure pit 100 yards from the house, but stretched out across entire continents, carried out by men whose names, in the vast majority of cases, simply weren't recorded anywhere worth looking. You already know two of them, in a sense, even though you've never been told their names either. The two gardeners sent out from Chatsworth to California, drowned somewhere on the far side of the world in pursuit of exactly this kind of ambition. A story this script told you back in Chapter 8, and one that the orchid trade, at considerably larger scale, was repeating constantly, all across the Victorian period, with almost none of it making it into any record anyone would ever read. What finally ended Orchidlerium in the closing decades of the century wasn't a sudden attack of conscience about any of this. It was simply better technology. As cultivation knowledge improved and as glasshouse engineering, the same glasshouse engineering you watched Joseph Paxton refine, building by building, across this entire script, got good enough to let orchids be propagated and grown reliably on British soil, the entire premise of the mania quietly collapsed. If a nursery in Surrey could grow you a perfectly good orchid without anyone needing to risk a fever in Borneo to find it, the romance and the scarcity both evaporated more or less simultaneously, and prices followed them down. An orchid today, descended in some unbroken cultivated lineage from exactly the kind of plant men once died retrieving, can be bought from almost any supermarket flower counter for less than the cost of a round of drinks. Nobody buying one gives the history a second thought. which is, by this point in the evening, a pattern you should be starting to recognize. Walk back out of the heat and the wet leaves and into the ordinary morning air and notice something. The sun is properly above the horizon now. Somewhere inside the house on the other side of all these walls, a bell of an entirely different kind, softer, more domestic, is about to be rung by someone whose job is simply to let the family know that breakfast is ready. Nobody ringing that bell has the faintest idea what just happened in the orchid house, the pinery, the rhubarb shed, or any of the dozen other buildings you've spent this entire night walking through. They're about to sit down and eat anyway. So are you, in a manner of speaking. It's time to go and watch.